I've been at podiums before where the light is too bright in your eyes, you can't see anything. I've never actually been one where you're in the dark, so no one can actually see you. But this isn't intentional, it's just accidental. We're not trying to hide from any of you, and we're open to all sorts of questions afterwards. I think you all know the story of the A320, and that's really the lead-in to the NEO. About 7,000 firm orders for this aircraft. About 4,600 delivered. We'll be shooting past 500 in the not too distant, rather 5,000 in the not too distant future. 2,300 on backlog. And by the way, that's relatively important. That's a larger backlog than the 737 has at the present time. And I'd like to refer to that a little bit later because I noticed a few of my colleagues out in Seattle appear to be in denial. They talk about how well the 737 is selling and we're only doing the NEO to catch up with them. I don't know what they're actually drinking out there. Anyway, we've got 95 million flight hours for this fleet of aircraft, 99.7% dispatch reliability. 99.7%. And an A320 takes off or lands somewhere in the world every 2.5 seconds. You think about that, you know, 1,000, 2,000, boom. The one's taking off or landing somewhere in the world with 99.7% technical dispatch reliability. Well, we had a big recession in this industry. In fact, we had a big recession in the world, as we all know. And look what happened to our production. Some of the industry observers, some of the industry forecasters, some of the people, the old men of the industry who predict the future said we'd be cutting production by 30, 40%. Well, as you can see, we really made very minor changes to production, very flat. We're now on our way back up to 40 aircraft a month, and in the dotted line, we're studying, that's a study, we're not announcing that yet, we're studying the ability to go to rate 42 or rate 44. And this is not for the NEO. This is for today's airplane. There is enormous demand for today's airplane right out there. I wish I could get more slots in 2013, 2014 right now, and I'd love to have some slots in 2012. Well, I think you know the story of the NEO. It really is a two-step story. It starts with today's aircraft, but then at the end of 2012, we introduced the Sharklet. We decided not to wait and just package it together with the NEO, but as soon as the Sharklet is available, it's being put into production. And we've got quite a few airlines around the world interested in that airplane. This is a little bit curved for some of you who are wondering, you know, where does it really come in before? You can see as you cross a little bit above 1,000 nautical miles, you're pushing pretty close to 3% fuel burn reduction, and then it's starting to get asymptotic as you go transcon US or transcon Australia. You really don't, in our opinion, we're being very conservative, get to 4%. I know that you know, APB and others out there advertise that you get 4%. Well, we're talking the difference between guaranteeing something and actually having a nominal number. Our 3.4% for 2,000 nautical miles is a guaranteeable number. If you ask the Air Partners, Boeing, what about their guarantee? We'll give you all sorts of brochures, but they don't guarantee anything. Sharklet's improved takeoff performance. It's not just a story about fuel burn, ladies and gentlemen. It's a story about takeoff performance. We can, with Sharklets, get up to 3 tons additional payload on this airplane, especially if you're limited on payload because of performance. You also can get more range, and here are some particular airports and runways with the difference improvements you can get. One that people would be surprised about is even Chicago Midway. You wouldn't think a big metropolitan airport like that would be runway limited, but it is a, you know, downtown, and you can get 1.7 tons more takeoff weight out of runway 4 right. Mexico City, obviously, you know the limitations there, 1.8 tons, Reno, 1.9 tons, or Quito, you'd expect Quito and Kathmandu, 2.4 tons, Canberra, 2.8 tons. So here's extra performance you get out of the airplane. You can also use less thrust for takeoff at a normal airport because you get better low speed and takeoff performance out of our Sharklet. And by the way, in case people haven't noticed, there are about over 1,000 757s built before they took it out of production. And some have already been replaced, some have been turned into freighters. Others, airlines have placed orders either with us at 321 or even with Boeing for some replacement for the 757, but we've identified 650 757s out there that people just haven't done anything about yet. They're still in service, their average age is 17 years right now, and no one has placed an order to replace them. We all know that they're going to need to be replaced over the next 5, 6, 7 years, and we would humbly suggest that we have the ideal replacement with an A321 with sharklets. Well, we have actually, let me rephrase that, we have a very good replacement. We have the ideal replacement if you put the Neo package with the new engine on it. But it's not just me saying that. So far, 8 customers have announced orders for sharklets, and even the godfather of the industry here has placed an order with his new leasing company for A320 family aircraft, but he insisted every one of them must come with the sharklets. That's Steve Hazy, as we all know, on the right-hand side. We also have something else we're offering available right now, about the same time that the sharklets are entering the market in the 2013 or so time period, and that's a new SpaceFlex lavatory. And what does this do? It does 2 things. One, it gets you 3 more seats. Now, so far, we're not raising the exit limit. Where's Wolfgang here? Well, he's going to work on it for me, right? So, but the fact is, we are not announcing a raising of the exit limit above the 180 seats in Europe, 179 seats in the US, but except for a few low-cost carriers, not too many operators are actually at the exit limit. So this allows you to, as you can see on the left-hand side, that's today's rear end of the aircraft, you move that over on the right, you take that lavatory, you move it to the back end where you're going to get 2 lavatories side by side, and we have that flexible door in between so that if you need a disabled lab, you can then use the key and open that door up, and you'll have the world's largest lavatory, and the only one, to the best of our knowledge, that for disabled people is available on a single-aisle aircraft. We now are introducing, and so is our competitor, disabled lavatories for wide-body aircraft, but not yet on single-aisle aircraft. This will be the first disabled lab that's available, and for most operators, you get 3 extra seats, and that changes the economics quite dramatically on any airplane when you're starting to add 3 extra seats. That's what it would look like in modular form over there. You can see that lavatory has been moved to the back. Decrease the galley content a bit there. Most operators have told us for the way this aircraft is being operated, basically 750, 800 nautical mile trips, hour and a half to 2 hours. They don't need all that galley space anyway. So that then brings us up to the story of the Neo, where we bring in the new GTF and we bring in the Leap X engine. And the one thing that the airlines who have been studying this have been telling us is, well, this is absolutely fantastic. We like your Neo. We don't know what Boeing is talking about when they talk to the world's airlines, and according to Boeing, people aren't that interested in a re-engined airplane. We have over 330 orders announced right now. You can imagine I've got a few more MOUs that haven't been announced, and we're on our way rather rapidly to an excess of 500 orders. This is the fastest selling aircraft ever in aviation history. We announced it at the end of December, basically about second half of December, just before Christmas, and here we are at the end of March, beginning of April, over 330 orders. I'm quite comfortable by the air show will be in excess of 500 orders for this airplane. The only negative I get right now is that why can't you do it faster? In fact, some airlines have actually pointed out that in December of 2010, we announced the A380, the most advanced aircraft in aviation history, with about 4.5 million parts on it, the super wide body, and we said we'd have it available in 2006. Well, we had some trouble with the interior, but we actually did get it certified and flying and doing demos in 2006, 6 years later. So some of these airlines, being not quite understanding of some of Tom Williams' constraints over there, said, well, gee, if you could do an A380 from scratch in 6 years, why is it taking you 6 years to put a new engine on your existing A320? Well, Tom and the team said, got a point there. So he came back with How about 2015? So thank you, Tom, and thanks to that program, we are going to have this airplane available in 2015, October of 2015. I think we've got a press release announcing that. The airlines are all delighted. They're all rushing to move their orders forward. And the important part about this is not just the availability of 2015, but if it's required, we'll be able to do a switchover from the Neo, rather from today's airplane to the Neo in 30 months. Now remember what it is though, it's a new engine option. So we're capable for the next 10 years producing today's airplanes and Neos side by side, if that's what the market wants. But if the market wants to switch over faster, and what I'm seeing right now with, let's say, 500 orders coming in by the air show, basically 100 orders a month coming in on this airplane, at that rate, maybe we want to switch over faster, and Tom and the team have found a way to do a switch over, theoretically, in 30 months, if that's what the market is asking for. So by sometime in the beginning of 2018, we could be producing all Neos, if that's what the customers are asking for. But again, I stress, it is up to the customers. We can do both. It's a new engine option. It's not a new airplane. And as you all know, and Tom will get into more detail about this, we've got the Sharklet. We have the new engines with the bypass ratio increased to 9 to 12, depending upon whether it's the leadbacks or the GTF. 81-inch fan diameter with the Pratt & Whitney airplane, and that gives us a 15% reduction in fuel burn. What does 15% mean? Well, the one thing it does mean is there's never been a model, an aircraft model in aviation history that offered double-digit, not even up to 15%, just double-digit reduction in fuel burn that wasn't a massive success. So when people, my competitors in particular, shrugging their shoulders saying, well, we don't know if it really means that much, that's why we're seeing 100 orders a month coming in on this airplane, because 15% reduction in fuel burn is astronomical. It equates to 1.4 million liters of fuel per airplane per year. Per airplane per year. That's the equivalent of what's consumed by 1,000 mid-sized family sedans every year for every airplane. That's 3,600 tons of CO2. 3,600 tons per year per airplane. That's equivalent to 240,000 mature trees. And we've got people around here, I'm sure you're doing it in your companies too, volunteering on weekends to plant trees, let's help the environment. Just introducing one Neo, you save the equivalent of 240,000 mature trees in terms of carbon dioxide a year. And then of course NOx as well, 50% below Chapter 6. And as we were saying before, if you want 2 tons, 2.4 tons more payload, or 500 nautical miles of range, and by the way, very, very, very quiet airplane. It's 15 decibels below Chapter 4, Stage 4 right now. Nobody knows exactly where Chapter 5 is going to be, but we believe that 15 dB below Chapter 4 is well within the range of Chapter 5 when they finally get around to doing that. And what about fuel prices? Well, I think we all know that fuel prices do bounce around an awful lot, but there's definitely a trend line here. You don't need least squares regression analysis to see that fuel is going up. It's consistently going up, and right now we're about $108 a barrel this morning. Our forecasts are that we'll be looking at $120 a barrel, not just as an aberration. It might bounce around a little bit. That's our forecast over there, which is pretty much lined up with other major forecasters around the world. With North Africa and the Middle East, there might be a peak now. When there's a peak, it might drop down a little bit below $100 a barrel, but then it'll be back up to its trend line, moving towards $120 a barrel, and not really coming back down. People who say that, well, you know, it was back down, you know, $30, $40 a barrel, why won't it go back down there again? Well, because there are 7 billion people in the world. 1 billion of those 7 billion are in the developed West, in the US, North America, Western Europe, Australia, Japan. The other 6 billion are in India, Africa, Brazil, China. And we've just had an inflection point. China is growing rapidly. About 10 new airports a year until 2020 in China. You're seeing a very similar, little bit slower growth out of India. Brazil and Latin America are taking off. That means fuel. And fuel demand is going up. It's not coming back down. Now, I'd like to take credit, and I don't want to get on the wrong side of Wolfgang as our chief engineer here, but it really isn't the airframe that creates the big breakthroughs in technology, at least in terms of fuel burn. Maybe in terms of technology, fly-by-wire, flight envelope protection. But if you want to have a massive reduction in fuel burn, it isn't coming from us. It isn't coming from Boeing. It's coming from the engine technology. Remember the beginning of the jet age? We started with straight jets. That was a big improvement, got speed. Then we realized we're burning a lot of fuel, throwing a lot of black smoke out the back, making a racket. We ended up with bypass ratios. Then we got to high bypass ratios. Then we got to ultra-high bypass ratios. And eventually, the next big breakthrough is probably going to be the unducted fan. And that's where you're going to see the next big jump of 20–25% reduction in fuel burn. Well, NASA is doing a lot of work on that. I think you've all seen the WTO report. They don't do it by themselves. They get U.S. manufacturers to help them out with this, and they get a lot of money for it. But the fact is they know a lot about propulsion technology. And this guy is the head of the research program. He's trying to be very positive about this, and he is. The next big breakthrough is coming somewhere around 2030, 2035, according to NASA, when we can figure out how to handle blade containment. We can figure out how to get the noise under control. It's probably an unducted geared fan with a lot of ceramics in the burner. And no one knows how to do all that yet and make it work and make it certifiable, but they think they'll get it sorted out somewhere around 2030, 2035. So we started talking about sometime after 2025 for our 30X to come out. We honestly think it's probably pushed into the next decade. Why? Because you want to change the configuration of your airframe to match this. But one of the things that Wolfgang Engler, head of our single-aisle program, sitting over here, when we were studying the NEO, did was look at, by 2020, what could we do if he had a clean sheet of paper? A clean sheet of paper. What engineers love, an unlimited budget. So a clean sheet of paper, a limited budget. What could we have done instead of the NEO on the airframe side? Assuming that the engines are just going to be the engines that are available in 2020. And he can tell you later in the Q&A, but what he came up with is around 3 to 3.4, 3.5%. If everything works better, you get, maybe it's a heavy composite. He could tell you what he did, all the best in aerodynamics, weight reduction, new systems, maybe more electric, etc. Anything you can do, just the airframe side of it, and by 2020, the airframe can be somewhere between 3 and 3.5% better than today's A320 airframe. And what do you get in 2020? You get that, if you want to spend your 10 or 12 billion, and the engines available in 2020, which happen to be the LEAP X, the GTF, or maybe something from Rolls, but in that same category of engine with similar SFCs. That's one of the reasons why we decided to do a NEO. So if our competitor decides he's going to do a clean sheet of paper airplane, what's he going to get? He's going to get something that's going to have a wider fuselage than the 737 with wider seats. It's probably called an A320. He's going to have something that's going to be fly-by-wire. Well, that's called an A320. He's going to have something that's integrated with the rest of his wide-body family. Well, that's called an A320. Our 320 cockpit, our 330 cockpit. He'll do a 787 cockpit, reverse engineered back down into the single aisle. But he will have spent about 10 to 12 billion US dollars to do it. And he will have an airframe that's 3 to 3.5% better than the A320. If he gets everything right, and considering the track record of the 787, that's not a given. But if everything worked, 3 to 3.5% better with the exact same engines we've got on the airplane, which is why they're backed into a little bit of a corner here. And the airlines know it, which is why they're placing orders for the NEO and not waiting. This is at our executive seminar in January. That's Rakesh Gangwal on the left, the little box on the right.
It's a remarkable coincidence, but when we had ordered back in 2005 100 firm airplanes, it was back then and still is the largest startup airlines firm aircraft order. And what we found out literally today is this 180 airplane order is the largest firm aircraft order in aviation history. And Airbus's records, what we hear is in terms of dollar values, nobody else has come to this number. We feel very comfortable, we have the right partners, the right support of all of the folks, we'll make it happen.
And that's the actual signing of the MOU there. And we're very proud of Indigo. They're very good operators, as many of you know. And we've had more than a few. Virgin America from North America, ILFC for 100, Latin America for TAM. We'll be announcing in the next couple of weeks another deal out of Latin America. Europe, Lufthansa announced their 30. Next couple of weeks, there'll probably be another announcement out of Europe. In the Asia Pacific, Indigo for 150. And sure enough, in the next couple of weeks, I hope to have another announcement out of Asia Pacific. So the momentum isn't slowing down. 332 orders now.
I just, you mentioned AirAsia then, what was the reference?
Oh, Asia Pacific is what I was trying to say.
Tried
Then
to
I
say, sorry.
stumbled over that, so you'll have to go ask Tony Fernandez himself about AirAsia. He keeps saying in the press he's going to buy the airplane. I'm just waiting for him to sign the contract and announce it, but he keeps saying he's going to buy it. At any rate, Richard Branson was also very positive about the
focused
airplane.
on shaking up the market for the consumer with a better value and the latest in amenities. We're just as committed to investing in the solutions that will make air travel more sustainable. And the NEO promises to be one of the world's most fuel-efficient commercial aircraft. Advancements like the NEO are not only good for the climate and our bottom line, but ultimately they're good for the health of our industry and the future of travel itself.
So when people say that the market doesn't know what it really wants, and the market hasn't decided whether this re-engining is the right way to go, I think that's just an awful lot of BS. The fact is the market is making it very clear what it wants. It wants the re-engined A320, and it probably wants the re-engined 737 as well, because if you have the capability of a 15% reduction in fuel burn, and you don't do it, that's how the industry starts getting into trouble. Because think about environmentalists, think about the public. If we've pushed technology as far as it can go, and the environmentalists want it to go beyond what's technically capable, well, we've got a very good argument, nothing else can be done. But when we say we can reduce fuel burn by 15%, we can save the equivalent carbon dioxide of 240,000 mature trees every year, but we're not sure the business case is right. That's when you get legislation. That's when people say you're going to be forced to do it. We had, while we were trying to decide on this last November, December, a Western European airline CEO actually came up with that as his advice. You've already talked about what you're technically capable of doing. I think you have an obligation to do it now. And that's why we're looking at this as not necessarily a new engine option, but a new engine or environmental obligation. Anyway, what is the airplane? Air spares commonality, about 95%, tooling and GSE, about 91%, maintenance training differences, mostly around the engine, 5 days, and for the pilots, self-study. You take that laptop in front of you, we give you the software, in the pilot's lounge you spend 2 hours, you get familiarized with it, answer a few questions, and you've qualified yourself to transition from an A320 to an A320neo. This isn't a new airplane. This is today's airplane with a new engine option, and I think that's very, very important going forward. And what will it do in terms of residual value? There's a little hand-wringing about that. Well, most of the lessors, and now people as they start thinking about it, realize it's not going to have any real impact on A320 asset values. Here's GCAS, Norm Liu, out at ISTATA last month. By 2027, you might get parity point on deliveries of the NEO with the current A320s. That's when I think you'll have a residual value effect. 2027. Here's the Godfather himself. I hope the appraisal community doesn't overreact to the NEO. The impact will be a very slow progression. A lot of NEOs will be for growth, not replacement. And if you really look at this, go back to the 737NG. What happened to the 737NG, the classics, when the NG was introduced? Well, what we saw, and here are all the appraisers lined up over there, so you take your pick, they all follow the exact same path. There was a 20% value drop. But when did it happen? It happened when Boeing had produced and delivered enough NGs to equal 50% of the installed base of the classics. And at that point, you see the inflection point, it starts drifting down by about 20%. Remember, that airplane wasn't a Neo. That airplane wasn't 95% common with the old build 737s. It was about 90% uncommon. The greatest marketing coup of all time was the 737NG, and it wasn't with the airline customers. They understood what was going on. It was with the FAA, convincing the FAA that a 90% uncommon airplane should have the same type certificate as they got in the original classic in 1966. At any rate, so the worst case scenario we see is exactly that. A 20% reduction. That's the worst case. It could be a lot better than that. So if we put that on our fleet, we see that we get to the 50% installed base inflection point at somewhere around 2023, 2025. That's when, at that point, you might, and I say might, see a gradual decrease in some residual values of today's build standard of the A320. And there's always a minority view. I couldn't believe that this was true and not a misprint, but it was in our press clippings. I went back and checked it from the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, March 28th. The CEO of Boeing, who came from the Defense Division, so we can't really blame him for this, claims that the 737, from an operating cost standpoint, cost of acquisition, capital, is about 8% better than the Airbus product. What is he drinking out there? And even after the Neo, it's going to be 2% better. Well, I don't blame Jim. I think he's a very nice guy, but some people in the marketing department in Seattle are veracity challenged. They really, really are, if they would come up with a line like that. Because I think any airline will tell you this is about the way it goes, and if you went out and checked with virtually any airline in the world, including a Southwest or a Ryanair, the most they would give is maybe Boeing gets 1 or 2% more in their favor than I'm showing here, and that's about it. Here's the 737. Boeing claims 124 seats, so I'll give them 124 seats. I put our new Space Flex in. Normally would be same seat count. We're now giving ourselves credit for 3 more seats. Fuel burn per trip, we say -1. Some airlines will say it's equal. Nobody says it goes in the other direction. Fuel burn per seat, because of the extra seats, I pick up on that. Range, we're looking pretty good. That's without the sharklets. Today's build, A319. No 8% better BS going on there. But what happens when we do the Neo? Now, here's where it really gets interesting. The same 127 seats. By the way, and I do apologize for black on black and stuff like that, but we're very creative color-wise around here. 16% lower fuel burn per trip, 18% lower fuel burn per seat, because I got 3 extra seats. Pure math. Cash operating costs per trip, 11% lower. Cash operating cost per seat, 13% lower. Look at the range. 4,100 nautical miles compared to their 3,300 nautical miles. We just got about North Atlantic capability on this airplane. Neo is much more efficient, flies much further. Now, we can do the same thing with the Dash 800, and that's the one where they're closest to us, because they've got more seats. They got that extra exit limit pushed up. They claim 162 seats on that. I think realistically it's probably a bit less, but we'll give them 162. We normally claim 150. I get 3 extra for the Space Flex galley in the back. Fuel burn per trip, -6%. Fuel burn per seat, -1%. O'Leary would probably say they're equal. Okay, we can do that. Cash operating costs per trip, -7%. Cash operating costs per seat, -1. These are where the airplanes get very, very close to each other, because they've got the extra seats in the 737-800. That's their best product to put up against us. But what happens to that when we do the Neo? Well, the seat count stays the same. Fuel burn per trip, not per seat, is 20% lower with our Neo than it will be with the 800. 15% lower per seat, because they've got the extra seats. Cash operating cost per trip is 14% lower. Cash operating cost per seat is 9% lower. And look at the range. 3,700 nautical miles versus 3,000 nautical miles. An extra 700 nautical miles in range, 9% lower cash operating cost per seat, 15% lower fuel burn per seat. And of course the A321, a similar situation. We've got 8 more seats. I think we've really got about 10 or 12 more seats, but we'll give them that. And we have about similar range right now, but when we do the NEO, look what happens over there. The range pops up by 700 nautical miles. We're 14% lower fuel burn per trip. We're 20% lower fuel burn per seat. 9% cash operating cost per trip, minus 11% cash operating cost per seat. We're burning less fuel. And what's the other thing that's going to affect you? Engine maintenance cost. Pratt is running around advertising a 20% lower engine maintenance cost, 20% lower than the V2500 or CFM56 today. The numbers we've put in here are 10% lower, not 20% lower, because we're not yet sure that Pratt is right, but they've got a very good argument as to why they ought to be right. Think about the stages they take out of the engine, etc., the number of blades fewer that they have in that engine. So they're running around saying we could be 20% better on engine maintenance costs. Well, if you burn 15% less fuel and you have 20% lower engine maintenance costs, your cash operating cost per trip is going to plummet. And that's exactly what we're seeing in the marketplace. That's exactly what the airlines are seeing, which is why they're placing orders at the rate of about 100 a month. Now, we'll maintain that indefinitely, but at least at the beginning, they're rushing to get these early delivery slots. So if you look at this in terms of aircraft currently in service, what's been ordered in the backlog for us and Boeing, and what's the open demand, by 2025, we had said the open demand would be about 8,000 aircraft, we'd get 4,000. This is just a continuation of that same chart out to 2030. The open demand is 12,000, and conservatively we say we get half of that. If Boeing doesn't do something, we're going to get a lot more than half of that. They'll have to come up with some answer to this airplane. They can't just stay there in denial and say, our airplane is so good that nobody will want the NEO. And the other thing we're doing, here are the life production runs of all these different models, the 727 DC-9, the early 737-200, then we go to the classic 737, then the NG. And you can see we entered service in 1988. And here we are in 2011. And a lot of people, a lot of our suppliers were thinking that, well, you know, by the end of this decade, the A320 is probably out of production and something else is going to enter the market. We've delivered about 4,600 now, 5,000 made by the end of the year, beginning of next year. By this 2015 point, we'll be up to about 6,000 aircraft, maybe a little bit beyond that. And what did we say? By 2030, we're going to sell another 6,000. So really, when the NEO enters service, we're at the 50% point. About 6,000 A320s will have been produced and will be in the fleet. And there'll be about another 6,000 to go to 2030. So really, the NEO ends up coming in right at the midpoint in that A320 production cycle. And a lot of our suppliers have just figured that out now, and they're talking about how much better their P&Ls are going to look over the next few years. 42 years to 2030. It'll be the longest continuous production run in history because we've kept the economics modern on the aircraft. So what's going to be the competitive response? Well, over the lunch or the coffee break, I'm sure you have all sorts of different theories about what it could be. I would just go back to history and say, what's happened before? Well, in, when was it? June. I guess it was June of 1985. We had the Paris Air Show, I believe, at that point in time. Well, in January of 1985, I started with Airbus as a salesman at Rockefeller Center in New York City. And I remember going to that Paris Air Show. I hope it was Paris. I think almost certain it was Paris. In 1985, and we had announced in '84 the launch of the A320 project. And we were the absolute laughing stock of that show. I can remember it, but I didn't realize what the hell I got myself into. You show up at your chalet, and everybody in the industry is laughing. We said we're going to sell 650 to 700 over 20 years. Boeing thought it was absolutely hilarious, so did McDonnell Douglas, and the engine guys were trying to be polite, but they were laughing too, because the 727-200 Advance was still in production. You get a brand new 150-seat 727 off production line. The 737-200 was coming off the line. They had announced the 737 Classics, the 300s. They were taking orders for those. The DC-9 had just evolved into the MD-80, and American Airlines had placed orders for 250 of them. And what did Airbus decided to do? Into all of these manufacturers sitting there in the 150-seat market, Airbus comes in with this fly-by-wire, joystick-controlled airplane and says, we're going to enter that market and sell 650 to 700. Well, they were right. We didn't sell 600 to 700, we sold 7,000, and we're on our way to about 12,000 aircraft. But what was the competitive response at that time other than laughing? There actually was one, if you recall, and it was called, I'll dig back into your files, the 7J7. Remember that guy? They're making a lot more money at Ford now than they made in aviation. But the fact is, they brought out the super-duper game-changing airplane. That's right. They brought that out in 1985 to answer the A320 Neo. Now what did they say? In July of 1985, right around the time of the air show, the 7J7 was promised in 2,500 days. By the way, this is all in the databases. Go back and pull up these articles. They're absolutely hilarious. Those are the Boeing charts over there showing where the 7J7 goes, the lower right-hand corner, how the fuel burn is going to drop off the right off the chart. In August of 86, 1 year later, they target 45% less fuel burn than the A320. A game-changing airplane. By the way, these charts you're all going to see at the air show again this year, only they're going to say the new game-changing airplane available in 2020. 1987, they, after a big engine competition, they selected GE as the engine supplier. In 87, a full cabin mock-up was at Le Bourget. I think it came by ship. In 87 August, they also postponed the aircraft by 1 year. In 87 December, there was an indefinite delay on it. And in 1993, they launched the 737NG after what happened? After United Airlines bought the A320. When United Airlines bought the A320, they decided they needed to redo their 737. And that's exactly what I think is going to happen again. When one big Boeing customer decides to go with the Neo, then all of this BS that you're going to hear at the air show about game-changing airplanes available in 2020 will stop, and you'll see a re-engined 737. Well, what happened when the A380 was launched in December of 2000? What was the competitive response? Same guy's out of here again. He comes out with the Sonic Cruiser. We launched the A380 in December of 2000. It took them 3 months to have an all-new game-changing airplane called the Sonic Cruiser. April of 2001, they start airline consultations. In July of 2001, a model was unveiled. It actually took them 6 months to figure out what it was. In 2002, fuselage barrel testing began. In 2002, big statements about people want to fly faster. 2002, the project was shelved in December of that year. And at least the New York Times wasn't fooled by this. There's a very interesting article that came out in June of 2001. Boeing does have a reputation in the industry for being fickle about new airplane projects. It announced a highly fuel-efficient jet in the early 70s called the 7J7, wanted to cancel the program a few years later. In the early 1990s, it talked about major Airbus partners about building the new Super Jumbo, remember that? And then remember there was also not just the Sonic Cruiser, they also said they were going to take orders for the 747-500 and the 747-600, and they dropped that program as well. So by this air show, you're going to see an awful lot of talk about game-changing airplanes. But there is a hard reality we all have to face, and that is, what do you do going forward? Fuel burn savings. An A320 Neo gives you 15%. A 737 re-engine will give you better than 10, but less than 15. So we'll gain a couple percent on them, and they don't like that idea at all. And I'll give them an all-new single-aisle jet. Remember, if they really do spend their 10 or 12 billion US dollars and get an all-new single-aisle, as Wolfgang says, maybe they get 3% more. So I'll give them 3% better fuel burn over there. But what happened to their operator base? They've just introduced a brand new airplane with a cockpit common with the 787. So that entire installed operator base of 737s are now fair game for the A320, because switching to the new, all-new game-changing Boeing airplane is a new cockpit, a new engine, new systems, new everything. And they're sitting there saying, well, gee, we're giving up an awful lot if we do that. Low investment. No, it's not low investment. An A320 Neo is somewhere around 1.5 billion. we're talking 10 to 12 billion for an all-new airframe. Low risk, it's certainly not low risk if you look at the history of the 787 right now. Look what happened there. Can they afford to do that with their single-aisle program? Will they get fly-by-wire? Well, yes, they'll get fly-by-wire. We've got fly-by-wire. If they re-engine, they don't get fly-by-wire, but they do get the commonality with their existing 737s. And if they do re-engine, they'll get containerized cargo, they'll have a bigger airframe, they'll have ways of hanging a bigger engine under the wing, etc., which you don't get with the re-engine. So, what's your choice? That's what they're looking at right now in Seattle. That's what we looked at when we decided to do the NEO. It was pretty obvious to us the only way forward. We think it's going to be pretty obvious to them about the way forward. Because our NEO has 15% lower fuel burn than today's aircraft. We have the very best environmental solution, and it's now available in 2015. We can be in the market early. We have minimum risk, maximum program confidence. We have the benchmark of reliability, 99.7%. You come out with an all-new airplane, you start from scratch again. It'll take forever to ramp up. You'll have to redo all the systems, all the maturity, when you can get 99.7% today. We have a huge market base. It takes the pilots 2 hours of self-study to transition. We have an asset that's got very good liquidity and good residual value. What about our other competitor? Well, we've got supposedly 90 orders from the C series, but I think what's very interesting, the only one I really pay attention to is the CS300. They've got 17 orders from LCI, who I'm not quite sure what they do out there, but they placed an order for 17 of those. And realistically, Republic, who is Frontier, 40 firm orders for the CS300. That one gets my attention over here. That, I think, is realistic. But that's it. After 3 years of marketing this product, they've essentially got 57 orders for the CS300. And if you look at the Comac 919, and they've got a lot deeper pockets than the Canadians, they've got about 45 firm orders, but except for GCAS with 5, if you look at them, they're all sitting there in China. And I know the Chinese market is big, but you cannot build an aircraft program around the Chinese market. So Comac has got deep pockets. They'll invest billions and billions and billions to stay in the game, but I think it's going to be a lot later rather than sooner before that airplane becomes a serious threat in the marketplace. So it's really back to the Boeing alternative versus the Airbus NEO alternative. We're sitting here now after 3 months with 332 orders and commitments, with 500 by the air show. And I was a little bit surprised when Morgan Stanley issued this in January, that Airbus could have 500 to 1,000. We actually, at the Airbus press conference, sort of poo-pooed that a little bit, saying, well, gee, I don't know what Heidi has been doing there. Well, actually, what Heidi was doing was her homework. She was not talking to me. She was out there talking to the world's airlines and trying to gauge what interest there was in the NEO, and she was absolutely astounded by how much interest she was getting in the NEO. Because Boeing was poo-pooing it. No, we're not sure. Our customers say there really isn't that much interest. We had just launched it. We thought it was good, but we weren't sure how good. And she had come up and said they'll have 500 to 1,000 orders. And ladies and gentlemen, she's right. We will have in excess of 500 sales of the NEO by this year's air show. And here's the airplane. It's going to change aviation history. Looks an awful lot like an A320. It's supposed to. With sharpness. Those are really sexy sharpness. So anyway, now we have Tom, who's going to give you a little bit more technical